Good afternoon, and welcome to Staff Council's second workplace conversation. I'm Leslie, co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee. Staff Council has a lot of great things happening right now. We are holding workplace conversations such as this one today. We have the Why I Vote campaign, and we encourage everyone to vote. Our Conversations with Staff event is scheduled for November 17th. The annual Sock and Blanket Drive is happening right now. We have a professional development reimbursement program you can check out. And there's Cougar Kudos to give a shout out to any staff member to show your appreciation. You can learn more about these events and our initiatives and see the dates for monthly meetings by visiting our website at www.uh.edu/SC. Trina Silva is my co-chair of the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee and has more information to share. So Trina, take it away.
Thank you, Leslie. And a big thank you to our guest speaker today and to all of you who have taken the time to join us today. Staff Council's Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee's mission is to recommend and promote diverse, equitable, and inclusive initiatives in alignment with the University of Houston's values to enrich the university's culture and enhance the staff experience. You can find out more information about our committee objectives on our website, which you can also see in the chat. With that, please allow me to introduce you to my event co-chair and our Staff Council historian, Carl Hearn, who will introduce today's speaker.
Thank you, Trina, and good afternoon to everyone who is joining us today. We're really excited to have you here today as we get ready to hear from our speaker, Mr. Varselles Cummings, who serves as the director for the Center for Diversity and Inclusion here at the University of Houston. Mr. Cummings comes to us from California, and he has over 11 years of experience in serving in various student affairs roles. He is also celebrating his 9th month anniversary as a member of the Cougar family today, so we say thank you and welcome. His other experiences include a 5-year stint at Texas A&M University, working for the Department of Multicultural Services as a program advisor and in the field of student life as a resident assistant. So we want to take this time to welcome Mr. Cummings, and without further ado, let us hear from him.
Awesome. Thank you, Staff Council, for affording me the opportunity to come and speak to you today. I was excited by the by the invitation. As he mentioned, my name is Varselles Cummings. I sometimes go by Var. I answer to both. I use the pronouns he, him, his, and I currently serve as the director to the Center for Diversity and Inclusion. As I do with all of my presentations, I always take an opportunity to introduce my staff, who I do this work with. But first, a little bit about the center. We are one of the newest centers here at the University of Houston, being established in 2014. So this month we are celebrating 6 years as being a part of campus. We're located in the Student Center South, down the hall from Starbucks and on the other side of the hallway from the bowling alley. But as mentioned, I want to introduce my staff because these are the individuals with whom I co-labor in doing this work of diversity and inclusion. And they are Nyoka Edwards and Kendall Wright, who serve as our diversity education program managers. And they help with content creation and presentations as well as programs. Our graduate assistant, Parnia Rosino-Back, and our center coordinator, Geraldine Laura. So these are the wonderful people who I have the opportunity to engage with on a daily basis to do the work of diversity, equity, and inclusion here on campus. So some objectives for today's presentation. When I was reached out to do this presentation, we had some conversations about the desire for several people not just staff council, but several people in this time that we're in, requesting presentations about diversity, about inclusion, about race. And part of the challenge that I found with facilitating these conversations and even starting them is that for many of us, we lack some of the grasp of the content and the definition of some of these words and really what they mean broadly, but also how we internalize those things. So we'll talk a lot about that. But the objectives for today is to increase participants' understanding of awareness, explore and discuss your personal cultural identity. Hopefully, as a result of this presentation, you'll become more comfortable discussing diversity-related topics. I always say it never stops being uncomfortable, but your comfort level with it can improve. Identifying steps on working more effectively across difference. And as I mentioned before, since the murder of George Floyd, the collective consciousness of our country and of our world has been raised. And while many folks have the desire to talk about diversity and racial justice, a few of us have a good grasp of what it all means and how it relates to us and the identities that we hold. Some agreements I hope we can come to today is welcoming multiple viewpoints, owning your intentions and your impact, using this opportunity to create and maintain a safe or brave space. I understand that's difficult for some because there are a variety of people in this team's room. There's positionality at play, so I know this is not the safest place for everybody. Well, when we're talking about some of these items, as best as we can to create that. Take risks, so lean into some of the discomfort that you may feel with discussing and having conversations about these topics. Assume good intent. Oftentimes, part of the challenge with having conversations about race, having conversations about diversity and inclusion, and just having conversations across difference is that folks are fearful of saying or doing the wrong thing. So I encourage you all to assume good intent, to actively listen, challenge with care, and then maintain confidentiality. There may be some things shared today that should not go out of this space. So as I tell students when I present to them, take the learning and leave the specifics. And with that, we're going to jump right in. Some of the presentation is participatory, so if you would use the chat feature to engage, and if you want to respond to a question, you can unmute yourself. So what does diversity even mean? We're talking about diversity. What does that mean? So what I want you to do right now is close your eyes for a second and paint what you think the picture of diversity looks like. So just take for a minute and think about, in your mind, what does the picture of diversity look like? And then in the chat box, if you would, describe what you see in this picture. What's in the picture? What does the picture entail? It doesn't have to be a long paragraph, but just put in the chat some descriptors of this picture that you see in your head when you think about diversity. I haven't seen any. Let's see here. Give folks some time. Differences, balance and reputation, gender, age, weight, ethnicity, Houston, Texas, different colors and shapes. These are all the things that are coming in the chat as people think about their visual of diversity. We have a variety of people with various styles and features, groups that look different, the University of Houston, equity. All of these are really good descriptors of diversity. My second question in this is, did you see yourself in this picture that you painted in your mind? Did you see yourself in this picture, or was it just other people's differences? And you can respond to that. That's because some folks say they saw themselves, yourself with others, a variety of lived experiences. And all of those are great. One of the things that I notice in doing presentations and talking with people is oftentimes we have this tendency to skip over ourselves when we think about diversity. We don't think about how the differences that make us who we are contribute to that diversity. And part of having conversations about difference and having conversations about diversity is being able to acknowledge that within yourself. Because what we what we know is that the differences in the diversity that we have our own social identities, they oftentimes determine our values, our cultural norms, the way in which we see the world, and the way that we show up in different spaces. So it's important for us to have this conversation about diversity, and I'll define it briefly. But many of us, and this is a general assumption, have been educated post the peak of the civil rights movement. So when we think about diversity, or when we're asked to acknowledge difference or think about difference, the sometimes the natural inclination is to think about the commonality and say things like, "I don't see difference," or "We're all one human race," or this idea of color blindness. Um, but what this ideology has done for some of us is made us uncomfortable with engaging difference. It's made us uncomfortable even acknowledging our own difference and how that contributes to a space. Um, so the definition of diversity, as we use it here at the University of Houston and in CDI, it's a long definition, but at its most basic principle, diversity is the presence of difference. But I am going to read to you the definition that we use, and that is the psychological, physical, and social differences that occur among any and all individuals, including but not limited to race, ethnicity, nationality, religion, socioeconomic status, education, marital status, language, age, gender expression and identity, cognitive and physical ability, learning styles, excuse me. All of those things contribute to diversity. It's not an exhaustive list, but those are some of the things that we typically think about when we think about diversity. A diverse group or community or organization and is one where a variety of social and cultural characteristics exist. So us being on this call, us being members of the Cougar family, us being a part of the departments and colleges that we're a part of, the committees that we're a part of, we contribute to the diversity in those spaces. So you're like, okay, yeah, that's diversity. We know that we have it. We know Houston is is the most diverse city in the country. The University of Houston is in the top 10. It ebbs and flows in that top 10 as to where we stand. With being one of the most diverse campuses in the country. But why does it all matter? If you look at our country, we are the world's most multicultural nation, and that's by ancestry and culture. By 2030, 1 in 5 Americans will be over 65 years old, and 2030 is just right up the street. By 2044, more than half of all Americans will belong to a minority group. So it's in quotes because I rarely use the term minority, but it's commonly understood. And that is to say that more than half will be a member of a group that is non-Hispanic white. By 2060, 1 in 5 of the nation's population will be foreign born. There are an estimated 9 million LGBT plus individuals in the US. Uh, and these are the reasons why diversity and our understanding of diversity matters. Um, Research shows that organizations and companies that are more diverse and that are culturally competent in practicing inclusivity, they usually have the highest employee engagement. and leads to higher performance. And then why it also matters, and this is kind of the crux of it, is that we don't always understand difference. And it's important to continue to engage in these conversations so that we understand it more fully and not shy away from it and embrace it. So on your screen, you'll see a list of different identities. And what I want you to do is take for a moment some time to write out, list out how you identify in these areas. So age, education, attainment, race, first generation American, your status in that. And then I have a couple questions that I'm going to ask. So just take for a minute and write down or think about how you identify in these categories. And I will note that sometimes it's called, as they're referred to as social identities. In this presentation, I'm calling them cultural identity, but they are sometimes used interchangeably. So as you look at this list and you think about how you identify on this list, what identity do you feel people see when they first meet you? Like, what is the identity you think people see when they first meet you? And you can put that in the chat. Somebody said race, gender, age. All of, and this there's no right answer. I always tell people when I come into a space, the first thing that people can safely assume is that I am male and that I am Black. Those are the first two things that pop up, and that's how I feel. The next question, what identity do you feel people know the least about you? And you can put those questions in the chat: education, attainment, nationality, socioeconomic status, ability, race and gender. Someone said how they became successful, socioeconomic status and education. So those are some of those invisible identities. So usually the identities we feel people see first are those ones that can be safely and easily assumed. Those identities that folks may know the least about are some of those identities that would require some conversation or some additional knowledge outside of just looking at a person. So we see things that came up like socioeconomic status and religion, and you won't know those things unless you've talked to someone or there's some physical or outward indication. What identity do you think about the least? In the list that's on the screen, and how you identify, what is the identity that you think about the least? Religion, race, nationality, religion, sexual orientation. And the common idea, the thing is with the identity that you think about the least, that is usually the identity where you carry privilege. And we don't, this is not the presentation where we're going to unpack and explore privilege. But we don't think about if you think about the ones that you listed, it's probably one of those identities that you carry privilege in. So I'll take ability, for example. I think about it the least. One of the identities I think about the least because I don't have to think about how things are going to be accommodated for me because they already are. Some folks put religion. If you identify as Christian in this country, we are privileged in that we don't have to decide when we are going to take off work for religious holidays because they're already embedded in our society. So that's something we don't have to think about as much. If you, some folks mention heterosexual as the identity that they think about the least. For the most part in this country, things are created or designed through a heterosexual lens. The next, and on the flip side of that, I said the identities that you think about the least are usually the identities that you carry privilege in. And on the flip side of that, those identities that we tend to think about the most are those identities where we are marginalized or have experienced marginalization. So for me, one of the identities that I think about most often and most frequently is being Black. And that is the identity that I have received the most marginalization in my lived experience. So that is the identity that I think about. I think about how my Blackness shows up in a space. And whatever that identity that you think about the most is probably the one that you have to negotiate with the most in terms, am I going to fully show up in this space as my full authentic insert identity? So it's important for us to understand that about ourselves and to think about that about ourselves, because if we don't have an understanding of how we engage with our own identities, it's difficult to engage with others who identify differently. Um, because part of exploring your own cultural identity, it will show you, it will hopefully lead you to where some of these thoughts, where some of these norms, where some of these values and belief systems that I have, where they come from. And it could be one or two things like, oh, that's interesting, that's great, that's still what I believe in, still my cultural, still my norm and what I subscribe to. And on the flip side of that, it's like, oh wow, I didn't realize that it was rooted in X, Y, and Z, and I need to change and unlearn some of this behavior. Someone just put an interesting comment in here that the identity that they fear for the future is age and ability. And one thing I didn't say when that's not on here, but it's really temporary ability, because we know that at any moment, at least physically speaking, we could, trip and fall, hurt an ankle, and we'll be temporarily disabled. But as we get older and our bodies age, that is a process that we go through. So as we continue to think about diversity, as you think about who you are, as you think about the identities that you carry, I want us to think about diversity as having layers. And some of you, if you are connected to this work or have been to presentations before, you may have seen this image. And it's commonly called the iceberg of diversity, or the diversity iceberg. And what this picture is illustrating, what we know about icebergs is that that a small portion of it lies above the water level. So that tip of the iceberg is generally a small portion of the entire iceberg. So when we engage, or as people engage with us, they're really only engaging with that 10% piece up there, unless we engage in further conversation and dive a little bit deeper. And that 10% is those visible identities. So race, if it can be safely assumed, ethnicity, gender, age, a lot of those visible characteristics, again, that can most often be safely assumed. And it's important to understand that, and to understand the assumptions that come with those identities that you carry. Because as it pertains to cultural self-awareness, the level of understanding each of us has about who we are and how we were influenced, this element of cultural competency asks us to ask ourselves some questions. So as you think about these identities, thinking about how what influences you have and how they have impacted your interactions with diversity, how they've impacted your interactions across difference. So some examples of some questions as you think about your own iceberg, and as you think about the icebergs that you will engage with. Talking about other people. How does things like your gender identity influence who you are? How has your family's socioeconomic status, or your current socioeconomic status, influence your relationships with money? What are some of the values that you've learned as a result of growing up in the city or state or town or country that you grew up in? Or how has your religious or spiritual upbringing affected how you interpret what is good and bad behavior? Those are things that we have to investigate in terms of our own iceberg before we, not I won't say before, but that will enhance how we engage with others across difference. Having a clear understanding of your identities and how those identities have been developed within you. If we look at the bottom of the iceberg, those are those invisible identities that we carry that folks may not ordinarily see. As you look at the picture, some of those identities that are closer to the waterline are some of those identities that you don't have to dig as deep to find out. But as you look at the image and go deeper, the the illustration is that you have to engage with people and dig a little bit deeper to understand those things. And same goes for you as you explore your own identity, digging a little bit deeper below the surface about those identities that we carry and understanding the depth and the breadth of them. Um, so I said that and this is not scientific math, so about 10% of who we are lies above that waterline, are those visible identities that we have, which means about 90% of the iceberg or 90% of who we are lies below the surface. And looking beneath that surface, it allows us to see the depth and breadth of our full person. And as we do that and go on that experience with ourselves, it also allows us to be able to engage with others, to know that there is more to them than what meets the eye. Um, so Imagine each of us as icebergs floating around other icebergs in our groups. We only see what's above the surface, and it's very easy for people to make assumptions about the stuff below the surface. So we may judge see someone's clothing, and make an assumption about their wealth. The problem that occurs with some of these assumptions, when some of these assumptions are wrong, is that icebergs begin colliding. And that's some of what we're experiencing and have been experiencing in our country. There are a lot of assumptions that we make about people and people's experiences, and people begin to collide. And while there's not much we can do to eradicate the colliding in general, what we can do is become more aware of others and have that understanding that there is more that is more that is more to individuals that meet the eye, and this takes taking a deeper dive. This takes engaging in conversation. This takes being a bit vulnerable about those identities that you carry and having those conversations, because a lot of the questions that many of you submitted when registering for this session, and some of the questions that I've received is, how do we have this conversation about diversity? How do we have conversation across difference? And part of that is being vulnerable and having this understanding that there is a lot more to people that meets the eye. And to engage in these conversations, it's important to have an understanding of who you are. So taking some time to do that research, to do that deep investigation of how you identify and what those identities mean to you, as you navigate the world, what those identities mean to you in certain spaces. And to be able to have these conversations in the workplace will require a level of vulnerability on your part, and a level of inquiry. So engaging with folks beyond the surface. It's hard to have difficult conversations about culture, about identity, these topics that are so closely related and are so deeply rooted into how people see themselves and just kind of this one-off thing. If you know that your organization or your office has not been the best as it pertains to inclusivity, it hasn't been the best as it pertains to having conversations across difference, then you can't just pop up one day, hey, we're going to have a conversation about race, or we're going to sit in a circle and create a committee and have a conversation about diversity without ever doing the work, without ever getting without ever setting the stage and environment for that. So it takes practice. It takes time, but it takes time. But ultimately, what it will take is you all, us being vulnerable with one another, and having these conversations, being honest with each other in these conversations, because what will come out of exploring these identities, your own cultural identities, what will come out are these beliefs and values that we hold on to, some of the biases that we carry, and being able to investigate and unlearn some of those things. So I have another activity that many of you may have seen before as well. It's called Circles of My Multicultural Self. And as I mentioned before, we can't talk about diversity or engage in honest conversation about diversity without first being aware of who we are and how our identities impact us both consciously and unconsciously. So what I would like for you to do is either draw out or just think about this diaphragm. In the center circle, put your name, and then on the outer circles, I would like for you to put three of your invisible identities and one of your visible identities. So I want you to take a moment to think about that. I'll put mine. It's already up there. So I'll put mine on the screen. So this is an example of mine. So my name there in the middle, the visible identity, my race, Black, African American, and some invisible identities that you may not know without further conversation, or diving a little bit deeper. And that is me being a Californian and being from California, my spirituality or how I identify in terms of religion, my current or socioeconomic status that I grew up with. You won't know those things unless there is a conversation. So my question to you all, as you think about this diagram, how do you share with others about the identities that they can't see? So how do you share with others your invisible identities? How have you been able to do that, if you do that? And you can put those responses in the chat. Through social media posts. And that's a good one if that's how you engage. Oh, the question is, how do you share with others your invisible identities or identities that they can't rightfully see? Some folks say they share when the situation calls for it, when having one-on-one conversations, and all of those are great. And there's no right or wrong answer. These are things for you to think about in terms of how you share and how you engage with people. Because if there are leaders on the call, how we engage with our staff members or how we engage, how we role model what that looks like is important. And sometimes we don't even think about that or haven't thought about that. Someone said one-on-one conversations when trust has been developed. And that's important too, because oftentimes, depending on what the identity is and the circumstances around lived experiences around those identities, it might not be safe to share those. It might not be safe. The environment may not be safe for you to do that. another question is, how does this show up in your workplace or influence your work in your workplace? And the question is, how does your level of sharing with others, or lack thereof, show up in the workplace or influence your work at all? Someone said when they want to create empathy with the student, able to connect with those with similar invisible identities on a deeper level in the workspace. And that's important too, the ability to find community. Someone said it keeps them very silent in some discussions at work, for not feeling a part of the group. And I think all of those things that's important to think about, particularly if you are a leader of an office, if you oversee a student organizations. We have to be mindful of how we show up in the conversations that we have, and people's comfort level of disclosing, and their ability to be safe and brave in a space to share some of these um, things. I think a lot of what think a lot about what is safe for office small talk. So that is a key point too. Someone said they think a lot about what is safe for office small talk. So even thinking about how we've been socialized as to what is appropriate to talk about at work, or what is okay, or what parts of our identities are okay to share and have conversations with at work. And all of those things matter. And like I said, there's no right or wrong answers to any of these questions. The point was an effort for you to really think about how this shows up in your space. Because we can't talk about diversity without first being aware of who we are and how our identities impact us consciously or unconsciously, because our identities and how we connect to them in whatever way will impact how vulnerable or how freely or not we share and have conversations about them. And as leaders, as staff members, as people who students look to, we have to be able to role model some of these things. So, what does it take? What would it take for you to be able to share a little bit more about some of those identities that may be invisible? What do you need to feel comfortable showing up as your most authentic self, embracing your identities here at work? So all of those are questions. I don't have all the answers to them, but those are questions to investigate as you continue your journey of learning. Uh, One of the things I wanted to, because I was going to show the video, but the video is a little long. So in terms of how we engage and how we engage with one another, how we engage at work, how we engage with students, we have to be mindful, again, of the identities that we carry, and also the biases and assumptions we make about other identities, even our own identities. Because what happens is we are in danger of creating this single story. And this phrase "single story" became popular in a TED talk by Chimamanda Adichie, and you may recognize her voice from the Beyonce "Bow Down" video or a song. But she talks about this idea of a single story, and that is the overly simplistic and sometimes false perceptions we form about individuals, groups, or countries. So again, thinking about how our identities, how we've been socialized, what we've seen, how that contributes to the perceptions that we have of people. I'll give you an example. So growing up, I used to see all of these feed the children commercials, and they primarily featured children children from the continent of Africa. Being born and raised in the United States in California, very limited interaction um, with African-born people. So my only story or frame of reference uh, for them is this commercial that I constantly sing, and I've talked to others who have a similar story, and part of that is it developed this single story that we all had about this great big continent, right? Um, so now the single story that we have about children from Africa is that they're hungry, that they have AIDS, and that we need to donate to them, that they are in this perpetual state of needing help. Um, and while that may be part of the story for a subset of the population there, that's not the only story, but that's the single story that we formed. So understanding that and being knowledgeable and being cognizant that media representation developed this single story in my mind that I had to unlearn. And I unlearned that through my engagement with other people and just through, growing up in further education and all that good stuff. One of the quotes what that was mentioned in this video is I've always felt it is impossible to engage properly with a place or a person without engaging with all of the stories of that place and that person. And again, this is not to say that you have to do a deep dive with everyone, but if we really want to engage in these conversations, we have to suspend the assumptions that we have. We have to ask questions about people's lived experiences, engage in conversation about people's lived experiences. And that doesn't always look like this formal presentation or workshops. That comes from relationship building. And that comes from having conversations with one another outside of these times of distress and angst. She goes on to say that the consequence of a single story is this: it robs people of dignity. It makes our recognition of our equal humanity difficult. So again, going back to the example that I use, I imagine, and even speaking with some friends and students who immigrated to this country from Africa, and the lived experiences that they've had growing up in this country as a result of that single story, as a result of the images that we saw that created this story that people from Africa are poor or don't have a lot, and that we have to help them. And then seeing people from Africa, from the continent, come to this country who are affluent, well-read, educated, all of those things, it kind of blows your mind as a kid and as a younger person, and even as an adult, as we begin to unlearn some of these single stories. It's important. Um, Sorry. The problem with the single story also is that it creates these stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is not so much that they're untrue, is that they're incomplete. And that's the whole idea. If we're only looking at the outside of a person, if we're only judging you by what we can see, if we're only judging you by the assumptions that we have grown up to believe about a particular group, then we have an incomplete story. And it is not, I mean, we all do this. It is human nature for us to categorize and to see patterns in different people. That is just part of human nature, and it's useful and healthy for us at times, but it also has some unintended consequences. So I'm in the interest of time, we're wrapping up, and I'm going to hopefully tie it in not a pretty bow, but give you some things to move forward. Because my hope with this presentation was not to give you all of the information, but to whet your palate and encourage you all to do some further self-investigation as it pertains to your social identities and cultural identities, and how that impacts how you see the world and how you engage across difference. So some things that you can do, personal practices to continue on your journey of learning about diversity and learning about your cultural identities. Number one is educate yourself. I say this flippantly, but also seriously. Google is free. I know there's a lot of misinformation out there, but if you like articles, if you like videos or podcasts and things of those nature, you can find all of that in a quick Google search. Or doing things like this, attending presentations, doing professional development, but taking your own journey as it pertains to learning about your identities, learning about culture and identity in general, taking that into your hands, not making assumptions. I know that's difficult for all of us, but practicing not making assumptions and also investigating where these assumptions come from. Practice active listening, especially as we engage across difference. Um, in these conversations, easy to be put on the defense. And when we're on the defense, we're not actively listening. We're listening to respond. So as people are engaging with you and talking to you and being vulnerable with you as they share their stories, practice active listening. Challenge yourself to be honest and open and take risks to address racism, sexism, homophobia, transphobia head on as it makes sense to you. Because everybody's fight in this, everybody's way to go about it is different. Recognize when someone offers criticism around oppressive behaviors. Um, it it is a treat and a gift, as I like to call it. Because they are being vulnerable with you and telling you how this is impacting their identity, how it's impacting how they are showing up. So take it as a gift of someone shedding light about how whatever the oppressive behavior was impacts them and how it may inadvertently impact others. I challenge you to not immediately go on the defense. Uh, Challenge with care. I know everyone is tense with everything that is going on in our country and our world. And again, it's easy to stay and be on the defense. But as you can, challenge with care. I mentioned earlier about assuming good intent. These conversations are difficult. These are the way in which we are having conversations and the amount that we're discussing diversity, inclusion, equity, racism, racial justice, all of those things is new in our country. Many folks are new to these concepts. These concepts and these systems are new, but many folks are new to it. So challenge with care and assume good intent as best as possible. Don't interrupt people who are speaking. So again, that's part of that active listening. And then share your stories, hear others, be vulnerable, create a space that makes your team, makes people who come around you comfortable sharing your story or sharing their story. Some organizational practices, commit time to learn about each other and share stories about lives and history and our culture and experiences. So outside of these types of conversations, outside of the required, not required, but the suggested D&I roundtable discussions that we're having in our colleges and offices, which are good, a good start, but we have to commit some time outside of that to learn and engage with one another. Create opportunities for people to develop skills on how to communicate and engage across different. So professional development opportunities that could look like, in staff meeting time to figure out how do we engage, how do we have this conversation, allowing people in your office to talk about an identity that may be invisible, that they may not have shared widespread, and giving folks an opportunity as they feel comfortable to share that. make a collective commitment to hold people accountable for their behavior. So an organization can be safe and nurturing for all people. So again, making this collective commitment to hold people accountable in your spaces of influence, and also holding your leaders accountable to be able to hold others accountable. What does that accountability plan look like? Because in our offices and in our spaces and units, there may be incidents that may not, whoever's been impacted may not see that it's a need for it to reach the level of an EOS or a formal complaint. But what is the department or organizational practice on how we engage and have conversations about these incidents? Um, Promote a culture of inclusivity, and that means being anti-racist, anti-heterosexist, transphobic, anti-ableism, um, and that is making sure that people feel safe and comfortable in the things that you do. And then remember that these are complex issues and they need adequate time and space. Be comfortable with not having closure after these conversations. Be comfortable with these being ongoing and ever present, because they have to stay before us in order for us to be able to engage with them honestly, and also to be able to mitigate challenges that arise. So remember that that this is a marathon and not a sprint. While there are some things that can happen quickly, there are other things that will take time. If we think about where we are in our country and the climate as it exists now, it didn't happen in a year. It took some time, decades, centuries, for us to get to this point. In our institution, there are practices and things that have been around for years. In our offices and departments, there are practices that took time to become what they are. So they will take some time to completely dismantle or change. Lastly, some things I want you to take away: that there are various aspects of diversity to be considered. Be knowledgeable about your identities, because oftentimes, as we investigate our identities, we also are able to investigate the values and belief systems that we have, and some of those biases and shortcomings that come up. As we think about diversity, as we think about inclusivity, think about whose voices aren't being heard, and encouraging them and providing space for those voices to be amplifying those voices. As we think about diversity, I mentioned it in an earlier slide, they make your team more successful. Diversity and inclusive environments is a great return on investment. Um, and then be mindful of single stories, and the single stories that we've created by how we've been socialized. Be mindful of those, investigate those, and figure out how do we get a fuller, broader, more complete picture. And then the last thing is that relationship building and further education can increase your capacity to be more culturally competent. Again, a lot of some of the questions that came up is, how do we have these conversations? How do we engage? And part of that is building relationships. And if you know anything about relationships, they don't instantly start out from a place of trust. That has to oftentimes be earned and be cultivated. The culture that exists within your space and spheres of influence, that culture had to be cultivated. And if we want that culture to change, we have to work towards that. We have to build those relationships. We have to ask whose voices are not at the table. We have to engage with people outside of just the staff meeting, outside of just the high and by. And what you will find is a lot of that vulnerability will come as you build relationships. A lot of that vulnerability and sharing some of these invisible identities will come as we have more conversation with one another, as we make mistakes, as we say the wrong thing at times and receive that correction. That builds our capacity to learn together. And with that, I will open the floor for questions. Actually, there are a couple of questions that the committee sent to me that were from the registration form. So I'm going to answer a couple of those, and I'll look in the chat to see if there are any more outside of that. So some of the questions, one of the questions, some of these I've already answered throughout the presentation. But it says, how can we take this information and open up a dialogue with family that believe they are not racist or biased because of what they had to work hard for? And I think that goes back to what I talked about even with you all, is having conversations. Where did these beliefs come from? Having the conversation about where did this stem from, or what information it is that you know about these other identities that you assume to know about. And usually if folks are saying that they're not biased or racist, it's a defense mechanism, which means there hasn't been a real conversation, an honest conversation being had. And I think the biggest way is allowing people to start where they are, not giving people passes and not giving them space to be bigots or be disrespectful or discriminatory, but understanding that we are all starting at different levels with respects to these conversations. That's something that I oftentimes have to remind myself when engaging with family, is that, you know, it's a process. One of the privileges that I carry is that I have education, and that I have had an opportunity to do this and to read and research and be in company with people who do this work. So my lens is a little bit different, and giving them a little bit of grace while also holding them accountable and providing resources to them. There's also questions about what the university has done with regard to or is doing with regards to DE&I. I know many of you all saw the emails from the president in the wake of George Floyd's murder, and since that time and this reckoning that we've all been dealing with, UH has developed. The president developed the task force on racial equity and social justice, which is led by Dr. Lee and Dr. McPherson. And that team is tasked to advise the president on how we can move forward in the direction of being better about the diversity that we have and leveraging it, making inclusive environments, and hopefully being equitable to not only faculty, staff, not only students, but faculty, staff as well. Another question is, how can I encourage colleagues to learn on their own versus asking me every question about Black, Indigenous, and people of color on topics and issues? I think being respectful and letting them know, again, these are some resources, providing them with resources, and being honest that today I don't have the capacity to educate. I appreciate your inquiry, but this is where you can go with that. Google is free. Somebody put that is a way to do that. If you do feel so inclined to engage in that conversation, being vulnerable and doing it, and also letting them know, like, I think being honest with them, like, hey, you know, this is like the 10th time that you've come to me this week asking about this particular topic or suggestion. Here are some resources, and I'll also suggest you go to X, Y, and Z. So those are some ways that you can address that. And I know that there are different nuances at play in terms of your position, and if this is a supervisor or someone you report to asking. So positionality is at play there. But hopefully you feel empowered to do that. And I see some of these questions popping in, but I want to be respectful of the time that we have allotted. And if you have some further and want some further more in-depth answers to these questions, or have further questions, feel free to reach out to me, and I'll put my email in the chat. That is not the correct email. I'm sorry. And I'll turn it over back to Carl, so we can wrap up and with any announcements that you may have.
Mr. Cummings, thank you. This was certainly enlightening and a wonderful presentation. and we are so very thankful to you for your time. Just a few housekeeping items, folks. Before we wrap up here, there's a survey about today's event. We will drop a link in the chat. We want to get your feedback on that, so if you will fill that out. And also, Mr. Cummings, the audience would like to know if the presentation would be accessible to them after the conclusion of this event. So
What I'll do is I'll send it to you all in a PDF format, and you can send it out to those who registered.
outstanding. And the last thing is, I believe you have an event tonight. If you would tell us a little bit about your fall speaker series.
Oh, yeah.
Engage.
So this evening at 6, I'm sorry, we will be having our the first part of our fall speaker series, where we will be having a moderated discussion with Latasha Brown, who is a voter organizer, specifically here in Texas and in the South. So we will be having conversations with her about organizing and the impact of our vote, and that is tonight via Zoom. You can find ways to register on our website, or you can visit our social media and you can register there. But that is tonight at 6. And then next week on November 5th will be part 2 of our fall speaker series, where we will be going live on Instagram with UH alum Ali Lozano. And she'll be talking about her work in the city of Houston as it pertains to voter engagement and how to stay engaged post-election. So this will be 2 days after the election.
And thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
And with that, we thank you all for coming and want you all to have a great day.
Awesome. Thank you.
Thank you. I will stop recording now. Thank you for joining us today.